My husband decided I wasn't worthy of his new elite circle. He told me not to show up at the company party I helped him build, and his family sided with him. For once, I didn't argue. I just left for the coast. As the sunset faded, my phone lit up. Dozens of messages from investors, and something had gone terribly wrong. "Stand there," Brian directed, pointing to the corner of our bedroom at 5:45 a.m. "I need to practice my investor pitch and you're distracting me." He was already in his designer suit, preparing for tonight's gala. I'd offered to help him rehearse, the way I'd done for 3 years since Nexus was just an idea. "Actually, just leave. This is for a different caliber of audience than you're used to. These are international venture capitalists, not your old McKinsey clients." He turned back to the mirror, adjusting his tie. "My mother will be there tonight to support me properly. She understands this world." I stood in the doorway of the bedroom we'd shared for 7 years, watching him practice, smiling at himself, and realized I'd become invisible in my own marriage. The way he dismissed me shouldn't have been surprising. The signs had been accumulating for months, small cuts that I'd explained away as stress from the Series C funding round. But standing there watching him rehearse facial expressions like an actor preparing for a role, I understood that this wasn't stress. This was who Brian Morrison had become, or perhaps who he'd always been underneath the startup hoodies and the vulnerable moments when he'd needed me. 3 years ago, Brian couldn't even stand in front of a mirror without breaking into a sweat. I remembered finding him in our garage at 3 a.m., surrounded by crumpled notebook pages, trying to memorize a 2-minute pitch for our first potential investor. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold the paper steady. I'd spent that entire night coaching him through breathing exercises, helping him restructure his talking points, recording him on my phone so he could hear how he sounded. By morning, he'd delivered the pitch flawlessly and secured our seed funding of $500,000. Now he was dismissing my McKinsey clients as if they were nothing. Those same clients who'd become Nexus's first enterprise customers when Brian couldn't afford a sales team. I'd leveraged every connection from my 5 years at the firm, calling in favors, arranging meetings on weekends, turning casual coffee conversations into product demonstrations. 3 contracts worth $2 million in recurring revenue that kept Nexus alive through its first year. But apparently that contribution had been erased from the official narrative. "Are you still here?" Brian asked without turning from the mirror. He was practicing his confident CEO laugh now, the one that sounded nothing like his real laugh. The real one was slightly nasal, ended with a small snort, and only came out when he was genuinely delighted by something. I hadn't heard it in 6 months. I walked back to the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the marble floors we'd chosen together when we'd signed the lease for this penthouse. Back then, Brian had insisted we needed a place that would impress investors when we hosted meetings. I'd agreed even though the rent consumed nearly half our budget. Now I realized I'd been furnishing his stage, not our home. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica Chin, my former McKinsey colleague who now served as Nexus's head of operations. I'd recommended her for the position when Brian needed someone he could trust with the company's internal systems. The message contained no words, just a screenshot that made my stomach twist. It was an internal budget document for tonight's gala, the kind of detailed spreadsheet I used to prepare for Brian when he was still learning how to manage company finances. There, under a section labeled Strategic Considerations, was a line item that read, "Attendance optimization. Spousal attendance limited to board members and C-suite executives meeting specific criteria." Below that, a note, S. Morrison does not align with current corporate positioning. Refer to family advisory input. Family advisory input. That meant Margaret and Thomas Morrison, Brian's parents who'd spent the first year of Nexus calling it Brian's expensive hobby, and suggesting he return to law school. They'd only changed their tune when the Series B funding hit and suddenly their son was worth $20 million on paper. Now they were advising him on which spouse met the criteria for a corporate event. I thought about our garage office where Nexus had been born. The card table we'd used as a desk. The whiteboard covered in my handwriting because Brian's was illegible when he got excited about an idea. The air mattress we'd inflated when we were too exhausted to drive home safely after 18-hour coding sessions. I'd written half the initial platform code while Brian focused on the architecture. My contributions were baked into every line of the product that had made him rich. The coffee maker beeped, pulling me back to the present. Through the kitchen window, Seattle was waking up, the early morning light catching the glass towers of downtown. Somewhere in one of those buildings, investors were preparing for tonight's gala, ready to pour more millions into Nexus Technologies. They'd shake Brian's hand, toast his vision, and never know that the company's first algorithm, the one that had caught their attention in the first place, was something I'd developed after Brian had hit a wall and spent 3 days convinced the entire project was doomed. My phone rang. Stephanie, I'm so sorry, she said immediately. I just saw the final attendee list. I can't believe they're doing this to you. It's strategic, I heard myself say, echoing Brian's corporate speak. Apparently, I don't project the right image for international venture capitalists. That's complete garbage and you know it. You built half that company. Your connections brought in the initial revenue. Hell, you taught Brian how to read a balance sheet. Through the bedroom door, I could hear Brian practicing his pitch, his voice carrying the artificial confidence he'd learned from expensive executive coaching. Nexus Technologies represents the future of integrated platform solutions, he declared to his reflection. Gone was the man who'd once described our company as trying to make boring business software slightly less boring. Margaret Morrison's influence was evident in every practice gesture, every calculated pause. She'd been grooming him for months, transforming her son from a nervous programmer into someone who could navigate country clubs and charity galas. Someone whose wife needed to meet specific criteria. Jessica, I said quietly, does everyone at the company know I'm not invited tonight? The pause told me everything. The executive team knows. Brian announced it at yesterday's leadership meeting. Said it was a strategic decision made in consultation with the board and family advisors. Family advisors. There it was again. I'd been evaluated by committee and found lacking. Jessica's words hung in the air as I set down my phone. The executive team knew. Everyone at Nexus knew I'd been formally excluded from tonight's gala. The humiliation wasn't private anymore. It was corporate policy. By 2 p.m. I couldn't stand the silence of the penthouse any longer. I dressed carefully in my best business attire, the charcoal suit I'd worn to our Series B closing, and drove to Nexus headquarters. The building we'd moved into last year gleamed in the afternoon sun, all glass and steel ambition. The security guard, Marcus, who'd known me since we operated from a co-working space, looked uncomfortable when I walked through the lobby. Afternoon, Mrs. Morrison, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. He knew too. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt endless. When the doors opened, I saw Jennifer, Brian's latest assistant, frantically typing at her desk. She looked up and her face went pale. Stephanie, Mr. Morrison is in a meeting with. I'll wait, I said, walking past her toward Brian's corner office. Through the glass walls, I could see him gesturing at a presentation, 3 men in expensive suits nodding along. The view behind him showcased Elliott Bay in all its afternoon glory, carefully chosen to impress visitors. Everything about that office was calculated for maximum impact, including, apparently, my absence. 20 minutes later, the investors filed out, barely glancing in my direction. Brian stood in his doorway, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, I said. He stepped aside, letting me enter before closing the door. The office still smelled like his cologne, something French that Margaret had gifted him. He walked to his desk, putting the massive oak surface between us like a barrier. You came here to make a scene? He asked, adjusting the Hermes tie his mother had given him last Christmas. The tie I'd watched him unwrap with such pride, as if that strip of silk represented his acceptance into some exclusive club. I came here for an explanation. A real one. Not corporate doublespeak in a text message. Brian sighed the way he did when he thought I was being unreasonable. Stephanie, these investors tonight, they're not from Seattle. They're Silicon Valley elite international venture capitalists who expect a certain level of sophistication. You're brilliant at strategy, I'll give you that, but this is about cultural fit. Cultural fit, I repeated. I have an MBA from Northwestern. I worked at McKinsey for 5 years. What culture am I not fitting into? It's not that simple. He moved to the window, gazing out at the water. These people can sense things. They read subtle cues. The way someone holds a wine glass, the references they make in conversation, whether they summer in the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard. You don't speak their language. I speak 3 languages fluently, I shot back. Including the coding languages that built the platform they're investing in. That's not what I mean, and you know it. The memory of last month's dinner at his parents' estate suddenly felt relevant. Margaret had invited her country club friend Victoria Ashworth, whose husband ran a private equity firm. I'd walked into the drawing room, yes, they called it a drawing room, to hear Margaret saying, "And this is Brian's wife, Stephanie. She used to help with marketing back when the company was still small." Used to. Was small. Every word chosen to diminish my ongoing contribution. Victoria had smiled, that particular smile reserved for people deemed beneath consideration. How lovely. And what do you do now? Before I could answer, Margaret had steered me toward a cluster of women discussing the upcoming hospital charity luncheon. Stephanie would love to hear about the fundraising committee, she'd announced, as if my strategic consulting background had evaporated the moment her son's valuation crossed 9 figures. Meanwhile, Brian and his father had retired to Thomas's study to discuss expansion strategies with Victoria's husband. I'd stood there, trapped in a conversation about table centerpieces, while the men planned the future of the company I'd helped build. "Your mother made it very clear last month that I don't belong in your world," I said now, watching Brian's reflection in the window. He turned around, his face set in that expression he wore during board meetings. "My family understands this environment. They've been part of it for generations. They only want what's best for the company." "What's best for the company?" I said slowly. "Or what's best for their image? Sometimes those are the same thing." He moved back to his desk, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "Look, my family agrees that sometimes the most supportive thing a spouse can do is step back. This isn't personal." "Your family agrees," I repeated. "When did Margaret and Thomas become the board of directors for our marriage?" "They're advisors. They have experience with this level of society." "This level of society." The words tasted bitter. "The level where wives are evaluated by committee and found lacking?" Brian's jaw tightened. "They're trying to help. Mom says your presence might send the wrong signal to potential investors worth hundreds of millions. These people expect a certain type of presentation." "A certain type of wife, you mean?" He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at his watch, a new Patek Philippe that had appeared on his wrist after the last funding round. "The gala starts in 4 hours. I need to prepare." That was it. No apology. No acknowledgement of what this meant. Just dismissal, as clean and corporate as a termination letter. I stood up, studying the man I'd married 7 years ago. Somewhere under the designer suit and practiced executive presence was the nervous programmer who'd needed me to hold his hand through every major decision. But that person had been carefully edited out of existence, replaced by this polished stranger who viewed me as a liability to be managed. "You're right," I said quietly. "I don't fit into this world you've created. The world where people are evaluated like stock options and marriages are treated like merger agreements." I walked to the door, then turned back. "Your parents must be so proud. You've finally become exactly what they always wanted. Someone who measures human worth in terms of strategic value." The drive back to the penthouse took 12 minutes. I spent them making a mental list. By the time I parked, I'd already pulled up vacation rentals on my phone. Cannon Beach, Oregon. A cottage on the coast, available immediately. The photos showed rough wooden walls, mismatched furniture, and an unobstructed view of the Pacific. Everything Brian would consider beneath our status. I packed methodically, choosing clothes Brian had always criticized. The comfortable jeans he said looked too casual. The university sweatshirts he claimed were not appropriate for someone in our position. The sneakers he tried to throw away because they weren't designer brand. Each item felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd gradually surrendered. The penthouse felt like a museum as I moved through it one last time. Every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every precisely placed artwork, all selected to project success and sophistication. None of it felt like home. Never had. I left my set of keys on the marble counter, next to the invitation for tonight's gala that bore only Brian's name. No note. No dramatic goodbye. Just absence, clean and simple. Let him explain that to his strategic advisors. The drive out of Seattle felt like exhaling after holding my breath for 3 years. In the rearview mirror, the city's skyline grew smaller. All those glass towers full of people calculating each other's worth. Ahead, the Pacific Coast Highway stretched toward something I'd forgotten existed. The possibility of being enough, exactly as I was. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched ahead of me as dusk fell. my headlights cutting through the coastal fog that rolled in like a living thing. 4 hours out of Seattle, I finally turned down the gravel road that led to the cottage, my car's GPS struggling to maintain signal. When the small wooden house appeared through the mist, perched on its bluff like a bird's nest, something in my chest loosened for the first time in months. Elena, the owner, stood on the porch wearing paint-splattered overalls and holding a lantern that cast warm light into the growing darkness. Her gray hair was twisted into a messy bun held by what appeared to be a paintbrush, and her smile held no judgment, only welcome. "You must be Stephanie," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "You look exactly like someone who needs to disappear for a while." The accuracy of her observation should have been unsettling, but instead it felt like permission. She handed me the keys, surprisingly heavy and old-fashioned, then gestured to a bottle of red wine sitting on the porch railing. "Local vineyard," she explained. "For whatever you're escaping or celebrating. Sometimes they're the same thing." The cottage was nothing like our Seattle penthouse. The floors creaked, the windows were single-pane and rattled in the wind, and the furniture looked like it had been collected from various estate sales over decades. But when I set down my suitcase and looked through the salt-hazed windows at the endless ocean, I felt more at home than I had in years. That first night, I sat on the worn couch with Elena's wine and listened to the ocean's constant conversation with the shore. No city sounds, no email notifications, no Brian practicing speeches in the next room. Just the rhythmic crash of waves and the occasional cry of a night bird. I turned my phone to airplane mode and shoved it into my suitcase, underneath the comfortable clothes Brian had always criticized. The next morning arrived with aggressive sunshine and the sound of seagulls arguing over something on the beach below. I made coffee in the ancient percolator, the kind that required actual attention instead of just pressing a button, and carried my mug out to the deck. The Pacific spread before me, endless and indifferent, not caring about quarterly reports or strategic positioning or whether someone's wife met specific criteria. I spent that first day walking the beach until my legs ached. The October air was sharp and clean, nothing like Seattle's exhaust-tinged atmosphere. I found myself stopping to examine things I hadn't noticed in years. The perfect spiral of a shell, the way kelp looked like calligraphy when it dried on sand, the tiny crabs that scattered when my shadow fell across tide pools. My fingers remembered how to work the old camera I'd brought, the one I'd bought in college when I'd dreamed of being a photographer before McKinsey recruited me. By the second day, I'd established a routine that would have horrified Brian. Wake whenever my body decided, not when an alarm demanded. Coffee on the deck while watching the fog burn off. Long walks with no destination. Reading actual books. The ones I'd bought years ago but never opened because there was always another pitch deck to review, another investor presentation to polish, another financial model to adjust. I was halfway through a novel about a woman who sells everything to buy a vineyard in France when Elena appeared on my deck on the third morning, carrying her own coffee mug and a sketch pad. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, though she was already settling into the other chair. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, her sketching the view while I pretended to read but actually watched her work. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had long ago stopped apologizing for taking up space. "You have the look," she finally said, not glancing up from her drawing, "of someone recalculating their entire life." "That obvious?" "I've been running this cottage for 15 years. I've seen every kind of escape artist there is. Divorced executives, burned-out doctors, writers with block, spouses who've discovered affairs. You're in the suddenly realized I've been living someone else's life category." I laughed, surprising myself with how bitter it sounded. My husband decided I wasn't sophisticated enough for his new social circle. Specifically, I don't meet the criteria for attending his company's investor gala. The one for the company I helped build. Elena's pencil paused. She looked at me then really looked, her eyes sharp despite the laugh lines surrounding them. "Let me guess," she said. "He got successful and suddenly you weren't the right kind of accessory anymore. His parents agree I might send the wrong signal to international investors." Elena snorted, returning to her sketch. "You know what I love about the ocean? It doesn't care about your net worth. Waves crash the same for billionaires and artists. Sand gets in everyone's shoes equally. The tide doesn't check your portfolio before it comes in." He was right, of course. The Pacific didn't care that I'd been deemed unsophisticated by the Morrison family standards. It didn't care that I'd failed to meet strategic criteria. It just kept being itself, vast and honest and completely unimpressed by human pretensions. That afternoon I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I cooked a meal without checking the time, without calculating when Brian would be home, without worrying whether it photographed well enough for the social media presence he insisted we maintain. I made pasta with butter and garlic, nothing more elaborate, and ate it on the deck while the sun set, turning the sky into a watercolor Elena could have painted. Later, I found a journal in the cottage's bookshelf, its pages slightly yellowed but empty. I started writing, my hand cramping because I'd grown so used to typing. At first, I wrote about Brian, about the hurt and humiliation. But gradually, other things emerged. The photography business I'd dreamed of starting before McKinsey's offer made me practical. The novel I'd outlined but never written because there was always something more important to do for Nexus. The teaching position I'd turned down because Brian said we needed to focus on our company. Except it had never been our company. It had been his company that I'd helped build, his dream that I'd supported, his success that I'd facilitated. Somewhere in those 3 years of coding and spreadsheets and investor meetings, I'd forgotten that I'd once had dreams too. Dreams that didn't involve IPOs or market valuations or impressing people who measured worth in stock options. On the 4th morning, I walked to the small town center, a collection of weathered buildings that looked like they'd been resisting change since the 1970s. The coffee shop had mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, nothing like the sleek Seattle cafes Brian preferred. The owner, a woman with flower in her hair, smiled when I ordered and didn't ask what I did for a living or where I'd gone to school or whether I summered anywhere impressive. I walked back to the cottage from the coffee shop as Saturday afternoon faded into evening, carrying a paper bag with fresh bread that the baker had pulled from the oven while I waited. The simplicity of that transaction, money for bread, no evaluation of my worthiness to purchase it, felt revolutionary after years of every interaction being measured for its strategic value. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when I settled onto the cottage deck with a glass of Elena's wine. October 7th, 7:15 p.m. 400 miles away, the doors of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel's Grand Ballroom would be opening for Nexus Technologies' Investor Gala. I knew because I'd toured that space with Brian 6 months ago, when he'd grabbed my hand and whispered that this would be our victory celebration. The memory felt like it belonged to different people entirely. I could picture it perfectly. The ballroom would be transformed with the precise lighting we'd selected together, the floral arrangements from the vendor I'd researched, the signature cocktails I'd suggested based on the German investors' preferences I'd discovered through careful investigation of their previous events. Every detail bearing my invisible fingerprint while my actual presence had been deemed inappropriate. The wine tasted sharp against the salt air. I watched the sun paint the ocean gold and tried not to think about Brian adjusting his tie one final time, Margaret standing beside him in whatever designer dress she'd purchased specifically to impress the international crowd, Thomas working the room with his practiced investment banker charm. All of them pretending I'd never existed or worse, that my absence was natural, planned, mutually agreed upon. My phone sat face down on the wooden table, still in airplane mode where it had lived for days. But curiosity, that terrible human flaw, began its familiar itch. What if something had gone wrong with the catering? What if Brian's presentation had technical difficulties? What if, and I hated myself for thinking it, what if he needed me? At 7:43 p.m. I turned on my phone. The screen erupted immediately. The notification sound became one continuous buzz as messages flooded in faster than the device could process them. 26 missed calls. 42 texts. 17 emails marked urgent. The phone actually grew warm in my hand from the sudden activity. Jessica's name dominated the missed calls. Her text started professionally and descended into chaos. Stephanie, please call when you get this. Something's happened with the German investors. Brian needs you to call immediately. Call me now. Everything is imploding. Where are you? This is insane. The investors are walking out. Brian's having a meltdown. Then something that made me sit up straight. A text from Margaret Morrison. In 7 years of marriage, my mother-in-law had never contacted me directly through my phone. She communicated through Brian or, when absolutely necessary, through formal written invitations. But there it was, urgent, family emergency. You must call immediately. I called Jessica first. She answered before the first ring finished. Thank God, she gasped, and I could hear chaos in the background, Raised voices, what sounded like chairs scraping, someone shouting about damage control. Stephanie, where have you been? Everything's falling apart. What happened? The Germans happened. The due diligence documents. Oh God, Stephanie, I tried to warn Brian but he wouldn't listen. Jessica, slow down. What about the documents? I heard her take a shaky breath. You know that junior analyst Brian hired last month? Kevin something? He was assigned to compile the due diligence package for the German investors. Brian told him to be thorough, to include everything that showed Nexus's operational excellence. My stomach tightened. And he included everything, Stephanie. Everything. All the internal communications about tonight's gala, the budget documents, the email chains. Including the strategic considerations document that listed you as excluded for not meeting criteria. Including Brian's email to the board where he wrote. She paused and I could hear papers rustling. Where he wrote, my wife's presence might send the wrong signal about our corporate sophistication. After consultation with my family advisors, we've determined her attendance would not align with our positioning for international investment. The wine glass slipped from my hand, shattering on the deck. Red liquid spread across the weathered wood like blood. The Germans saw it? Ingrid Hoffmann herself. You know, the managing partner of Rain Technic Ventures? The one controlling $2 billion in assets? She was reviewing the documents during the cocktail hour. Brian was in the middle of his presentation about Nexus's values and corporate culture when she stood up. She stood up during his presentation? In front of everyone. 200 people, all the major investors, the entire board. She held up her tablet with the document displayed and said, Stephanie, I'm not exaggerating, she said. Mr. Morrison, could you explain why your wife, who according to your own company history helped build this platform, has been excluded from tonight's event for failing to meet sophistication criteria? I sank into the deck chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Jessica continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. The room went dead silent. Brian tried to explain, said it was taken out of context, that it was a mutual decision. And then Ingrid said, God, everyone heard it. We don't invest in companies whose leadership treats people as strategic liabilities. If this is how you value the person who helped build your company, how will you treat other stakeholders when it becomes convenient? She said that? In front of everyone. Into the microphone. Her words echoed through the ballroom. Then she closed her portfolio, stood up and walked out. Her entire team followed. 6 other international firms left with them. The Americans are still there but they're all on their phones with their boards. The press was invited tonight, Stephanie. Tech bloggers, financial reporters. Someone already posted about it on Twitter. It's trending. I looked at my phone, finally noticing the notification badges on various apps. Messages from numbers I didn't recognize, LinkedIn requests. Even a text from my college roommate asking if I'd seen the news. Brian must be. He's destroyed, Jessica said simply. He tried to continue the presentation after the Germans left, but his voice was shaking. Margaret tried to do damage control, going table to table, but people were already pulling up the documents on their phones. Someone leaked the whole package to TechCrunch. The headline is, Nexus CEO excludes wife from gala for lacking corporate sophistication. His phone hasn't stopped ringing. Through the phone, I heard a door slam and Brian's voice, high and strained, shouting something about containment strategies. Then Margaret's voice, shrill and demanding, insisting someone fix this immediately. I should go, Jessica said. It's chaos here. But Stephanie? That German woman, Ingrid? Before she left, she walked past Brian and said, loud enough for others to hear, success that requires diminishing those who helped you achieve it isn't success. It's just ego with a business plan. She's my new hero. Jessica hung up, leaving me alone on the deck with the shattered wine glass at my feet and the sound of waves that suddenly seemed too loud. My phone screen continued lighting up with notifications, each one a small explosion in the darkness. I watched the numbers climb. 57 unread texts, 31 missed calls, emails multiplying like a virus. The financial news apps I'd forgotten to delete started sending alerts. Nexus Technologies stock plunges in after-hours trading. German investment firm withdraws from Nexus deal. Breaking. Multiple investors exit Nexus gala following document leak. Each headline felt surreal, like reading about strangers instead of the company I'd helped code in our garage. My phone rang. Brian's photo appeared. The one from our wedding where he looked young and grateful and nothing like the man who'd dismissed me that morning. I let it go to voicemail. Within seconds, another call. This time from a number I didn't recognize but with a Seattle area code. Then another. And another. I turned off the ringer but kept watching the silent calls stack up like accusations. At 8:47 p.m., I finally started listening to the voicemails. Brian's first message still carried his CEO voice, controlled and measured despite the chaos Jessica had described. Stephanie, we have a situation that requires immediate management. There's been a misunderstanding about tonight's documentation. Call me back so we can coordinate our response. This affects both of us. The second message, timestamped 12 minutes later, showed cracks in his composure. Stephanie, I know you're getting these messages. The German investors have withdrawn. The press is involved. We need to present a unified front. Please call me. By the third message, his voice had shifted from commanding to urgent. The board is meeting right now. They're talking about my resignation. 3 more firms just pulled out. That's $280 million in commitments gone. You have to help me explain this. Tell them it was your choice not to attend. The fourth message abandoned all pretense. Stephanie, please. TechCrunch posted the story. It's everywhere. My phone won't stop. Reporters, investors, the board. They're saying I've destroyed the company's reputation. This can't be how it ends. Not after everything we built. The fifth message was barely recognizable as Brian. The stock is down 38%. 38%, Stephanie. Do you understand what you've done? The board is panicking. We need you to say this was mutual. Please. I'm begging you. I moved to the next voicemail. Thomas Morrison's voice filled my ear, cold and threatening in a way I'd never heard before. Stephanie, this is Thomas. I don't know what game you're playing, but you're destroying our family's reputation. Brian's career is in ruins. Margaret is being bombarded with calls from our associates. If you don't immediately release a statement supporting Brian, I'll pursue every legal option available. This vindictive destruction ends now. Vindictive destruction. As if I'd orchestrated this. As if I'd written the documents that excluded me or leaked them to investors. As if I'd done anything except leave quietly when told I wasn't wanted. The next message made me actually laugh, sharp and bitter in the night air. Margaret's voice, trying for warmth but achieving only condescension. Stephanie dear, surely we can handle this like adults. Yes, there were some unfortunate misunderstandings about tonight's event, but that's no reason to let Brian's career burn. Surely you can put aside your feelings for the sake of the family reputation. We've always welcomed you. Here she paused and I could practically hear her choosing her words, despite the differences in our backgrounds. Don't let pride destroy everything. Call me back so we can craft an appropriate response. Despite the differences in our backgrounds. Even now, even while begging for my help, she couldn't resist that final dig. As if my middle-class upbringing was a character flaw I should be grateful they'd overlooked. My phone lit up with another call. This number I recognized. David Winters, chairman of Nexus's board. The man who'd once told me at a company dinner that I was Brian's secret weapon. I listened to his message with growing disbelief. Stephanie, David Winters here. I'm calling with a proposal that could benefit everyone. The board is prepared to offer you a consulting contract. $200,000 for 6 months of advisory work. Minimal actual duties. In exchange, you'd sign a standard NDA and release a statement clarifying that you chose to skip tonight's event to focus on personal projects. We could have the contracts drawn up tonight, funds transferred Monday. This protects everyone's interests and allows us all to move forward. Call me back within the hour. A bribe. They were trying to buy my silence, to pay me to validate their story that I'd never really mattered to Nexus's success. $200,000 to agree that I was exactly what they'd claimed, unnecessary, unsophisticated, better off absent. My phone buzzed with a text from someone at Forbes. Ms. Morrison, would you like to comment on tonight's events at Nexus? We're running a story about corporate culture and spousal value in tech startups. Another from the Wall Street Journal. Can you confirm whether you were formally excluded from tonight's gala? Bloomberg. Reuters. TechCrunch. The inquiries poured in, each reporter sensing blood in the water. My phone battery dropped from 60 to 40% just from processing the incoming messages. Through it all, I sat on the deck watching the ocean, which continued its ancient rhythm completely unbothered by the implosion happening 400 miles away. The waves crashed and retreated, indifferent to stock prices and corporate reputations. A text from Jessica cut through the media requests. Security footage from the ballroom is online. Someone filmed Ingrid's walkout. It's already at 50K views. Brian tried to have it removed, but it's been downloaded and reposted everywhere. The comments section is brutal. I didn't look for the video. I didn't need to see Brian's face when his carefully constructed world collapsed. I'd seen that expression before in smaller moments. When an early investor passed on Nexus, when our first product launch had critical bugs, when he'd realized his parents' approval was conditional on success. But this time I wasn't there to rebuild his confidence, to remind him of his worth, to help him find solutions. Another voicemail from Brian, this one only 30 seconds old. His voice was hollow, defeated. Stephanie, the other investors are leaving. All of them. The entire gala is ending 2 hours early. Everyone's going home. Mom and Dad left without saying goodbye. I'm standing in an empty ballroom that cost us $40,000 to rent. Please, just tell me what you want. What will it take for you to help me? What did I want? The question felt too big for the moment. I wanted the last 3 years back. I wanted the husband who'd cried with joy when our first customer signed. I wanted the life we'd planned before success had rewritten all our definitions. I sat there with Brian's broken voice still echoing in my ear, asking what it would take for me to help him. The phone felt heavy in my hand, glowing with 37 voicemails, each one a piece of the desperation unfolding 400 miles away. The sunset had deepened while I listened, transforming the Oregon sky into layers of gold bleeding into purple, the kind of natural beauty that existed completely independent of human drama. What would it take? The question assumed I had demands, that this was a negotiation where I held leverage I intended to use. But sitting there watching the light fade over the Pacific, I realized I didn't want anything from Brian or his family or Nexus Technologies. I didn't want apologies or explanations or the consulting contract David Winters had dangled like a carrot. I didn't even want revenge, not really, because revenge required caring about the outcome. I wanted silence. My thumb hovered over the power button. One press and I could respond to Jessica, could return Brian's call, could engage with the machinery of crisis management that was surely grinding through the night in Seattle. Margaret would have assembled advisors by now, crafting statements and calculating damage control. Thomas would be on the phone with his legal contacts, exploring options for containing the fallout. Brian would be pacing his empty ballroom or his corporate apartment, refreshing social media feeds to watch his reputation crumble in real time. They wanted me to participate in their panic. Every call, every text, every voicemail was an invitation to join their chaos, to help them manage the consequences of decisions they'd made about my worth. Even David's bribe assumed I could be brought back into their narrative for the right price. I pressed the power button and held it until the screen went dark. Then I did something I hadn't done since college, before smartphones became extensions of our bodies. I found a small screwdriver in the cottage's kitchen drawer, removed the phone's back panel and took out the battery. The device became just a rectangle of glass and metal, harmless and silent. The physical separation felt significant. It wasn't just airplane mode, which could be undone with a swipe. This required deliberate action to reverse, a barrier between me and the temptation to check just one more message, to see if Brian had called again, to witness the ongoing collapse of everything he'd built while excluding me from it. I poured another glass of wine, my hands steadier than they'd been all evening. The broken glass from earlier still littered the deck, catching the last light like scattered garnets. I'd clean it up tomorrow. Tonight I just wanted to sit with the strange, unsettling relief of watching something end without trying to fix it. The ocean had turned dark, visible now only as sound and the white foam of breaking waves. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, other lives were unfolding. People were having dinners and arguments and celebrations, completely unaware that a tech company's gala had imploded or that a woman sitting on a cottage deck had just chosen silence over engagement. I heard footsteps on the gravel path around midnight. Elena appeared carrying a thermos and wearing a thick cardigan over her paint-stained clothes. She took one look at my face, at the dismembered phone on the table, at the wine bottle significantly emptier than it had been at sunset, and settled into the other chair without asking permission. "Bad news or good news?" she asked, pouring something hot and fragrant from her thermos into the mug she'd brought for me. I realized something herbal that smelled like comfort. "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. Then, because the darkness and her presence made honesty easier, I added, "My husband's company just collapsed at a gala I wasn't invited to. Investors walked out. His career is probably over. And I'm sitting here feeling something that's not quite happiness but isn't sadness either." "Relief," Elena said simply. "You're feeling relief." I looked at her, this woman I'd known for less than a week, and felt tears start. Not the crying I'd done in Seattle when I discovered the exclusion document, which had been hot and angry. These were different, cooler, almost cleansing. "I should feel terrible," I said. "I should want to help him or at least feel sorry for him. But I just keep thinking about how quiet it is here. How the ocean doesn't care about any of it." Elena was quiet for a moment, sipping her own tea. Then she said, "I left a law firm 15 years ago. Manhattan. White shoe firm where I'd spent a decade working 100-hour weeks. I'd just won them their biggest case. Pharmaceutical company, 9 figures at stake. The managing partner called me into his office the day after the verdict." She paused, and I could see the memory playing across her face in the porch light. "I thought it was about partnership. I'd been promised the track. Instead, he told me I wasn't partnership material. Said I was brilliant in the courtroom but lacked the polish and presentation their clients expected. Too intense, too focused on the work instead of the performance. He suggested I might be happier at a smaller firm where expectations were different." "After you won them millions," I said. "After I won them millions," she confirmed. "So I walked out that day, packed my apartment that week, and drove across the country until I found this place. Bought the cottage with my savings, started painting, and never went back. Best decision I ever made." "Did they call you?" I asked. "Try to get you back?" Elena smiled, and it was the kind of smile that held years of earned wisdom. "They called for months. The case I'd won started having complications. The client wasn't happy with the replacement attorney. They offered me senior partner, my name on the door, a corner office. I never answered. Eventually they stopped calling. Last I heard, the client left the firm entirely." She leaned forward, her eyes catching mine in the dim light. "You know what I learned? Silence is the most powerful response to people who've fundamentally misunderstood your value. They expect anger or hurt or negotiation. They're prepared for all of that. But silence forces them to sit with their decisions without your participation." My phone sat dead on the table between us, and I thought about Brian in his empty ballroom, Margaret making her damage control calls, Thomas threatening legal action, David offering his bribe. All of them expecting me to respond, to engage, to help them manage what they'd created. "My friend Jessica called before I turned off my phone," I said. "The German investor who walked out released a statement. She said success that requires diminishing people isn't success. It's just ego with a business plan." "Smart woman," Elena said. "It's already being shared everywhere. The whole disaster is public now. Brian's probably being eviscerated on social media. And how does that make you feel?" I considered the question honestly, sitting with the complexity of my emotions. Satisfied isn't quite right. Vindicated feels too active. It's more like watching the natural consequences of decisions play out without my interference. Like I finally stopped trying to manage outcomes that were never mine to manage. Elena raised her mug in a small toast. To natural consequences and the freedom of not interfering. We sat together until nearly 2 in the morning, talking about everything except Brian and Nexus. She told me about her art installations, about learning to trust her creative instincts after years of legal argumentation. I told her about the photography dreams I'd abandoned, about the novel I'd outlined but never written, about all the versions of myself I'd set aside to build someone else's empire. When I finally went inside, I left the dismembered phone on the deck table. In the morning, I'd extend my cottage rental. I'd spend days walking beaches, helping Elena prepare for her upcoming gallery show, eating meals that required no documentation or strategic purpose. I'd discover what it felt like to exist without an audience, without trying to prove my worth to people who'd already decided I lacked it. Revenge, I was learning, didn't require action or planning or carefully orchestrated consequences. Sometimes revenge was simply choosing peace while someone else's carefully constructed world collapsed under the weight of their own decisions. Sometimes it tasted like salt air and herbal tea and the absolute silence of a phone that couldn't ring. The week at Cannon Beach stretched into 8 days, then 9, then 10. Each morning I woke to the sound of waves and the absence of urgency, and each morning I chose to stay one more day. Elena never asked when I was leaving. She simply adjusted the rental agreement, waving off my concerns about her other bookings with a paint-stained hand and the observation that the cottage seemed to know who needed it. But on the 11th morning I woke with a different feeling. Not dread exactly, but a clarity that the silence had done its work. I discovered what I needed to know about myself, about what I wanted, about who I was without Brian's ambitions defining my days. Now I needed to see what remained of the life I'd left behind. The drive back to Seattle felt longer than the escape had been. October had deepened into late autumn, the trees along the highway stripped of their leaves, everything rendered in shades of gray that matched my uncertainty. I'd turned my phone back on that morning, letting it charge while I packed, but I hadn't looked at the messages. There would be time enough for that chaos once I arrived. The city appeared through the rain around 4 in the afternoon, its skyline emerging from the mist like a familiar stranger. I'd lived here for 7 years, but driving through downtown toward our penthouse, I felt like a tourist observing someone else's life. The coffee shops where Brian and I had planned our early strategies. The restaurant where we'd celebrated our first major contract. The park where we'd walked on Sunday mornings before success had filled every weekend with networking events. Our building's parking garage told the first story. I pulled into my designated spot and noticed Brian's Tesla was gone. In its place sat nothing, just empty concrete marked with the faint tire tracks of his departure. I sat in my car for a long moment, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal and trying to prepare myself for whatever waited upstairs. The penthouse felt abandoned the moment I opened the door. Not empty. All the furniture remained, all the carefully chosen artwork still hung on the walls, but hollow in a way that had nothing to do with physical occupancy. The air tasted stale, as if no one had opened a window in days. Mail had accumulated on the entry table, mostly bills and corporate correspondence addressed to Brian. I walked through the rooms slowly, noting the small absences that marked his departure. His toiletries gone from the bathroom. The closet half empty where his suits had hung. His laptop missing from the desk in the study. He'd taken only what he needed and left everything else like evidence of a life that had stopped mid-sentence. On the kitchen counter, I found a single envelope with my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside were divorce papers, the language formal and cold. Irreconcilable differences appeared multiple times, each instance a bureaucratic translation of 3 years of gradual erasure. There was no note, no explanation beyond the legal terminology. Brian had communicated his final decision through his attorney, maintaining his professional distance even in the dissolution of our marriage. I should have felt something, anger or grief or even relief. Instead, I felt only a distant curiosity, as if I were reading about someone else's divorce. The papers requested nothing unreasonable. Asset division would be negotiated. The penthouse lease was in both names. Everything could be handled through lawyers, no direct communication required. I left the papers on the counter and looked out at the city lights beginning to glow in the early evening darkness. Somewhere out there, Brian was living in a corporate apartment, probably still wearing his designer suits and practicing his executive presence for whatever remained of his career. The thought held no satisfaction, no vindication. It simply was. The next morning I met with Catherine Wright, the attorney Elena's friend had recommended. Her office occupied a modest suite in a building far from the gleaming towers where Seattle's elite firms resided. The furniture was comfortable rather than impressive, the art on the walls originals by local artists rather than investment pieces. She greeted me with a firm handshake and eyes that suggested she'd heard every story and judged none of them. "I've reviewed the divorce filing," Catherine said once we'd settled with coffee. "Straightforward language, no unusual requests. But I thought you should know what's been happening with Nexus Technologies since the gala incident." She pulled out a folder thick with printed articles and financial documents. The top page showed a graph of Nexus's stock valuation, the line dropping like a cliff edge after October 7th. 40% decline in valuation, Catherine continued, her finger tracing the descent. 3 board members have resigned, including your former father-in-law Thomas Morrison. The company lost not just the German investment but 2 other international firms that were in late-stage negotiations. Total capital withdrawal of approximately $400 million. I stared at the numbers, trying to connect them to the company I'd helped code in our garage. $400 million. The figure felt abstract, too large to attach to the small decisions that had led here. Brian's position? I asked. Still CEO technically, but the board has stripped him of several key authorities. He's essentially a figurehead now while they search for replacement leadership. His parents withdrew their financial backing 2 days after the gala. According to my sources, Margaret Morrison told several people at her country club that they needed to protect their other investments from association with the scandal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret, who'd been so concerned about my presence sending the wrong signal to investors, had herself sent the clearest signal possible by abandoning her son when his reputation became a liability. There's more, Catherine said, sliding another document across her desk. International expansion plans have been suspended indefinitely. The London and Singapore offices that were scheduled to open next quarter have been cancelled. Several key employees have left for competitors. How many employees? 43 in the last 10 days. Including most of the original engineering team that built the platform with you and Brian. I thought of those early days, the people who'd believed in Nexus when it was just an idea. Good engineers who'd taken salary cuts to join a startup, who'd worked impossible hours because they believed in what we were building. Now they were leaving, taking their institutional knowledge with them, and I couldn't blame them. My phone rang as Catherine was organizing the documents. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. I answered, putting her on speaker with Catherine's permission. Stephanie, thank God, Jessica said, her voice tight with stress. Are you back in Seattle? Can we meet? I'm back. What's happening? What isn't happening? The office feels like a graveyard. Half the desks are empty. The ones that aren't empty are occupied by people updating their LinkedIn profiles. Brian barely leaves his office. When he does, he looks like he hasn't slept in days. Margaret and Thomas haven't been to a board meeting since the scandal broke. People are saying they're too embarrassed to show their faces. We arranged to meet for coffee that afternoon at a small place near Pike Place Market, deliberately choosing somewhere far from Nexus's offices and the corporate haunts where we might encounter people from that world. Jessica looked exhausted when she arrived, her usually perfect appearance softened by shadows under her eyes and hair pulled back in a simple ponytail rather than her professional style. We found a corner table where we could talk without being overheard. It's dying, she said without preamble. The company. I've been through acquisitions and layoffs before, but this is different. This is watching something rot from the inside because the foundation was corrupt all along. That dramatic? Stephanie, investors are actively demanding Brian's resignation. Not suggesting. Demanding. The remaining board members are in daily meetings trying to figure out how to remove him without triggering the clause in his contract that would give him a massive severance. Meanwhile, he's in his office making desperate calls to every contact he has, trying to rebuild relationships he destroyed on his way up. She paused to sip her coffee, and I could see her hands were shaking slightly. You want to know the worst part? He's confused. Genuinely confused about why people won't take his calls. Why the same investors who courted him 3 months ago won't return his emails. He actually said in a meeting yesterday that this was all a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. A misunderstanding, I repeated. He doesn't get it. He thinks this is about public relations, about managing a narrative. He doesn't understand that people saw exactly who he is and decided they don't want to do business with that person. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender's name made me pause. Ingrid Hoffmann, the German investor whose walkout had started everything. The subject line read simply, a conversation worth having. I opened it while Jessica watched, curious. The message was brief and direct, written in the efficient style I'd come to associate with European business communication. Ms. Morrison, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out personally following the events of October 7th. I've been following your career and contributions to Nexus Technologies, and I believe you have been systematically erased from a narrative you helped create. I would like to discuss funding a consulting firm under your leadership. Anyone who helped build a company from nothing while being diminished at every turn deserves the chance to build something where their value is recognized. I'll be in Seattle next week if you're available to meet. I read it twice, then showed it to Jessica, who read it once and started laughing, the slightly hysterical sound of someone who'd been waiting for good news in a desert of disasters. "Oh my God," Jessica said. "Ingrid Hoffman wants to fund you. Do you know what this means? She controls $2 billion in assets. She doesn't make casual offers." The email sat on my phone screen, glowing with possibility. Somewhere across the city, Brian was making desperate calls that went unanswered. His parents were avoiding board meetings. His empire was crumbling under the weight of decisions made in consultation with family advisors who'd valued sophistication over substance. And here, in a modest coffee shop far from the towers of ambition, someone was offering me the chance to build something new. Something where my value wouldn't need defending because it would be fundamental to the foundation. I looked at Jessica, then back at the email, and felt something shift inside me. Not revenge. Not vindication. Just the quiet recognition that sometimes the most elegant response to being erased is to become impossible to ignore. I typed my response to Ingrid Hoffman right there in the coffee shop, my thumbs moving across the phone screen while Jessica watched with barely contained excitement. The message was simple, professional, accepting her offer to meet the following week. When I hit send, Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand, her eyes bright with something that looked like vindication but felt more like hope. The meeting with Ingrid took place in a hotel conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, neutral territory that belonged to neither my past nor my uncertain future. She arrived exactly on time, her presence commanding without being aggressive, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of quality rather than display. We shook hands and I noticed her grip was firm, the kind that communicated equality rather than dominance. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her accent slight but present. "I've done my research on your contributions to Nexus Technologies. The initial platform architecture, the enterprise client acquisition strategy, the bridge funding that kept the company alive in month 6. All documented in early filings before someone decided to edit the narrative." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of documents I'd nearly forgotten existed. Early investor presentations with my name listed as co-founder, email chains showing my technical contributions, even a photograph from a local business journal featuring Brian and me together in our garage office, back when my presence was still considered an asset. "This is who you were before you were erased," Ingrid continued. "I want to fund the consulting firm that allows you to be that person again. Not in service of someone else's vision, but building your own." 6 months later, I stood in my new office on the 7th floor of a building in Fremont, far from the downtown towers where corporate ambition measured success in square footage and floor height. The space was modest, 3 rooms with large windows overlooking Puget Sound, the water visible between the buildings like a promise of escape always within reach. My name was on the door in simple lettering. Morrison Strategic Consulting. I'd kept Brian's last name, not out of sentimentality but because it was still legally mine, and changing it felt like giving him more attention than he deserved. Besides, there was a certain poetry in building something successful under the same name he'd tried to exclude from his achievements. The firm had launched quietly in April. No press release or grand opening, just word of mouth through the network of people who'd watched the Nexus scandal unfold and drawn their own conclusions. Ingrid had been true to her word, providing seed funding and connecting me with founders who valued substance over performance. Within 2 months, I had 3 major clients. The first was a female-founded startup in biotech, a company developing diagnostic tools for early cancer detection. The founder, Dr. Sarah Chin, had reached out after Ingrid mentioned my name, saying she needed someone who understood what it meant to build something real while surrounded by people more interested in appearances. I helped her structure her Series A pitch, connecting her with investors who asked about her science before they asked about her pedigree. The second client came through Jessica, who'd finally left Nexus in March when it became clear the company was beyond saving. She joined a mid-stage fintech startup and recommended me to their CEO, who needed help navigating expansion without losing the culture that had made them successful in the first place. I'd spent 6 weeks embedded with their team, teaching them how to scale without sacrificing the values that had attracted their early employees. The third was a nonprofit focused on bringing technology education to underserved communities, work that paid modestly but mattered in ways that Nexus never had. The executive director told me during our first meeting that she'd specifically sought me out because she wanted someone who understood that impact wasn't always measured in valuations and exit strategies. My office was furnished simply, nothing like the carefully curated spaces Brian favored. A solid desk I'd found at an estate sale, comfortable chairs for clients, bookshelves holding texts on strategy and leadership alongside novels and poetry collections. On one wall hung several of Elena's paintings, vibrant abstracts that reminded me of Cannon Beach and the week that had changed everything. But the most important piece sat on my desk in a simple frame. A photograph I'd taken that night in October, the sunset over the Pacific painted in layers of gold and purple. I'd captured it minutes before turning on my phone and discovering Brian's world had imploded. The image held no people, no corporate logos, no markers of success or failure. Just the ocean and sky in conversation with each other, indifferent to human drama. I looked at that photo every morning when I arrived and every evening before I left. A reminder that the most elegant form of moving forward wasn't dramatic or calculated. It was simply building something true while others discovered the consequences of their own choices. News of Brian reached me occasionally through professional channels, the kind of information that circulated through Seattle's tech community whether you sought it or not. He remained CEO of Nexus Technologies, though the company he led bore little resemblance to what we'd built together. The valuation had stabilized at roughly 40% of its peak, the international expansion plans remained suspended, and the once vibrant office culture had calcified into something cautious and diminished. In May, Jessica had forwarded me a Seattle Times announcement with a single word of commentary: "Wow." Brian was engaged to Vanessa Hartley, daughter of a prominent Seattle family whose wealth predated tech booms and whose social connections ran through every elite institution in the city. Margaret had been quoted in the announcement describing Vanessa as "from a good family who truly understands our world." The subtext so obvious it barely qualified as subtext. I'd studied the engagement photo, searching for traces of the man I'd married. Brian stood in his designer suit, Vanessa beside him in something tasteful and expensive, both of them smiling the careful smiles of people who understood they were performing for an audience. He'd gotten everything he'd apparently wanted: the right kind of wife, the CEO title, his mother's approval. But the image held a hollowness that even professional photography couldn't disguise. According to Jessica's sources, he still went to the office every day, still wore his Hermes ties and practiced his executive presence. But he led a company that had lost its momentum and its soul. The engineers who remained did so because they needed the salary, not because they believed in anything Nexus was building. The innovative culture we'd cultivated in those early days had been replaced by careful risk aversion. Every decision filtered through layers of committees designed to prevent another scandal. The Morrison family's social position had shifted in ways that seemed to cause Margaret particular distress. Jessica had heard through her network that Margaret and Thomas had quietly withdrawn from several country club committees, their names no longer appearing on the boards they'd once prominently served. Their famous holiday party, which had once drawn 200 guests from Seattle's elite circles, had shrunk to a modest dinner for close friends and family. Thomas had been overheard at a restaurant in June, his voice carrying farther than he'd intended after several drinks. "We never should have encouraged Brian's ambitions beyond his capabilities," he told his dinner companion, a statement that revealed more about the Morrison family values than any amount of polished public presentation ever had. When success was assured, they'd claimed credit for Brian's vision. When it faltered, they'd blamed him for reaching beyond his station. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had deemed me insufficiently sophisticated had themselves become cautious about public appearances, their social currency devalued by association with a scandal they'd helped create. Margaret, who'd been so concerned about signals sent to investors, had sent the clearest signal of all by abandoning her son when his reputation became a liability, only to return when he'd secured an engagement that restored some measure of social acceptability. I turned away from my computer and looked out at Puget Sound, watching a ferry cross the water in the late afternoon light. My phone sat on the desk beside the Cannon Beach photograph, silent except for legitimate business calls and messages from the small circle of people who mattered. No desperate voicemails, no panic, no crisis management. Just the steady rhythm of building something sustainable. Elena had visited last month, taking the train up from Oregon to see what I'd created. She'd walked through the office slowly, examining everything with the artist's eye for detail, then stood at the window looking at the water. "You did it," she'd said simply. "You built something that's actually yours." The photograph on my desk caught the light as the sun shifted, that October sunset glowing like ember. I'd learned something important during that week at the coast, something that had taken months to fully understand. The most elegant revenge wasn't planned or executed with careful strategy. It wasn't about making someone suffer or orchestrating their downfall or even watching their consequences unfold. It was simpler than that. It was building a life so firmly grounded in your own values that other people's judgments became irrelevant. It was finding peace in the distance between who they'd decided you were and who you actually became. It was discovering that the ocean's indifference to human hierarchies was a kind of wisdom worth internalizing. Brian had his title and his appropriate fiancée and his mother's qualified approval. He wore his designer suits to an office that grew emptier by the quarter, leading a diminished version of what we'd built together, having gained the appearance of success while losing everything that had made it meaningful. And I sat in my modest office helping founders remember that people who build the ladder deserve to climb it too, working with clients who valued substance over sophistication, building something that felt true in ways Nexus never had. The ocean didn't care about elite circles or strategic positioning or whether someone's spouse met specific criteria. It just kept its ancient rhythm, crashing and retreating, indifferent to human ambition. I'd learned to carry that indifference inside me not as coldness but as freedom, the freedom to build without performing, to succeed without diminishing others, to find peace in simply being enough exactly as I was. If this story of quiet triumph resonated with you, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Stephanie chose silence over engagement, removing her phone battery while Brian's world collapsed 400 miles away. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more compelling stories of resilience and reinvention. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.